This week we're wrapping up our tale of backwoods villages and Wild West outlaws, but before I get into that I want to take a moment to remind you of Wild West Extravaganza. It's one of the best Wild West history podcasts out there. You'll hear about cowboys, outlaws, lawmen, and interesting characters of all varieties. It's a hilarious and extremely well-produced show that will have you hooked immediately. Follow the link in my show notes to subscribe to Wild West Extravaganza today. Last week I told you about a local legend that haunted me as a child. The mysterious and infamous Sammyville. I told you about the insane rumors that circulated about it. The eccentric founder and his family, the lawless Horrell brothers who terrorized Texas and New Mexico. This week, we'll cover the fate of the lawless Horrell boys and take a quick look back at Sammyville. My name is Josh, and this is Obscure History. When the Horrell brothers had settled in Lampasas, Texas the first time, things were good. They found their place, did their best to make a living, and even made some good friends. The Higgins and Horrell families were said to be a close-knit group of fun-loving, hard-working families. They played together, they ranched together, they enjoyed the freedoms of the open range together. But that was before the Horrell brothers had gone on their bloody crusade, before they had killed 2 lawmen and dozens of innocent civilians. When the Horrell brothers settled in Lampasas, Texas for the second time, things went poorly. Right from the start, the Horrell brothers knew that they were no longer welcome. Shortly after arriving, they were tried for the murder of Captain Thomas Williams. They were ultimately acquitted of the crime. According to C.L. Sonicson of the Texas State Historical Association, at some point during the next 2 years, they quarreled with their former neighbor John Pinckney Calhoun Higgins, who accused them of stealing his stock. On January 22, 1877, Pink Higgins shot and killed Merritt Horrell in Wiley and Toland's Gem Saloon in Lampasas. Legend claims that this was the same saloon where the 4 state police were killed in 1873. The 3 remaining Horrells were determined to call to account Higgins, his brother-in-law Bob Mitchell, and his friend Bill Wren. On March 26th, as Tom and Mart Horrell were on their way to attend a session of Judge W.A. Blackburn's court, they were waylaid 4 miles east of Lampasas by the Higgins party, which was concealed along the banks of a creek known today as Battle Branch. Tom was knocked out of his saddle, badly hurt. Mart, less seriously hit, stopped his frightened horse, dismounted under fire, and ran off the attackers single-handedly. The next battle was apparently accidental. It occurred on June 7th, 3 days after the Lampasas County Courthouse had been burglarized and district court records were destroyed, including the bonds of Pink Higgins and Bob Mitchell. Both factions happened to be in Lampasas that morning. Fighting broke out in the streets. Bill Wren was painfully wounded, and Frank Mitchell, Bob's brother and cousin of Pink Higgins' wife, was killed. Jim Buck Miller, alias Palmer or Waldrop, was a newcomer to the Horrell gang and was also killed. Finally, the citizens were able to persuade the clans to cease firing and get out of town. As usual, the Texas Rangers had to be called in to keep the factions from exterminating each other. A detachment surprised the Horrells in their beds and persuaded them to submit to arrest. Major John B. Jones got the 2 sides to agree to stop fighting. Early in August, they signed a pair of unusual documents, in which they agreed to regard the feud as a bygone thing. Many Western historians think this might have been the final settlement of the Horrell-Higgins feud, but the actual end may have come in the following year. In 1878, Tom and Mart Horrell were suspected, rightly or wrongly, of complicity in the robbery and murder of a county storekeeper in the southwestern part of Bosque County. They were eventually shot to death by a vigilante mob while being confined in the Meridian jail. This may have been the final settlement of the Horrell-Higgins feud. Sam Horrell, the only Horrell left, moved his family to Oregon in 1882. He died in California in 1936. Pink Higgins moved his family to the Spur area in the 1890s and worked as a ranch detective for the Spur Ranch. He died of a heart attack at his home in 1913. Now, it's important to note that the Samuel Horrell that fled to Oregon after the Horrell-Higgins feud would later be known as Samuel Horrell Sr. The branches are difficult to untangle, but it seems that Samuel Horrell Sr. stuck around Oregon just long enough to leave behind a Samuel Horrell Jr., who fought in World War I, and who also left behind a Samuel Horrell III, who would later become the governor, judge, postmaster, and sheriff of Sammyville. Though Sammy Horrell came from a lineage of Wild West mayhem and adopted a sort of John Wayne persona, he was actually quite different than his grandfather, who had once been one of the most infamous men in the West. According to Los Angeles Times writer Kim Murphy, Sammy was a devout Seventh-day Adventist. He begins every meal with a prayer. Up until recently, he and Annabelle ran Elgin's community food bank out of the back of the church. The money they earn comes from rental properties both in Sammyville and Elgin. And there is very little that anyone in town might need that they couldn't get by calling up Sammy and asking if he happens to have it on hand. His back 40 is one of the wonders of the West. Under the trees stretching from the road out to the bottom of the canyon lies everything that Sammy has hauled out of Elgin and packed away for more than 25 years. Upwards of 150 cars, some 2/3 of which he has vague plans to repair someday in case someone might need one. Their hoods open to the drizzly sky. The hushed forest paths open into vistas of old washing machines, oil stoves, school buses, hundreds of bicycles, lawnmowers, tractors, army trucks, tires, sofas, and mattresses. There's a pile of lumber 5 feet high and 40 feet long that constitutes the remains of an old motel. Once Sammy and his crew were called out to demolish the old Assembly of God church in downtown Elgin. By the time they were done, there wasn't a screw left, said one businessman in amazement. They just packed it up and hauled it away. So it seems that Sammy wasn't just a rootin' outlaw or a mutant or a murderer. His life and legacy is much more complex, but before we wrap up this episode, I've got to stop and pay the bills, so hang tight for about 90 seconds. So it seems that Sammy wasn't a renegade lawman or inbred mutant or serial killer or any of the things that I had been told as a child. I never met Sammy, but the more that I read about him, the more distant those small-town rumors feel. According to some sources, he would allow tenants of Sammyville to rack up an entire year's worth of back rent before evicting them. It's said that for his legendary reputation as a wild and fearsome outlaw, his greatest joy came from simply sitting on the porch of his house, looking down the long dirt road that led to Sammyville, and from providing for those who couldn't provide for themselves. You see, when I was a kid, I was told that Sammyville was a repository of the world's worst. The cheaters, liars, fighters, addicts, criminals, and other various types of low-life scum. And as a kid, it only made sense that those people gathered together because they were up to something. It's the Scooby-Doo effect. As a kid, I heard that there were bad people out in the woods, and the first association that we all made is that they've got hidden treasure or some sort of ungodly motive or dastardly plan. But the reality was that the people of Sammyville needed a home. They needed shelter and food and order, and the rest of society had taken all of those things away from them. Sometimes because of their actions, but others just because the world can be a cruel and unforgiving game of roulette. Sadly, after fighting health complications for some time, Sammy Horrell passed away in 2014, leaving control of Sammyville to his daughter and son-in-law. They plan to fix the place up a bit, but keep the spirit of Sammyville alive and well. Sammy's legacy is remembered well by Dick Mason of the LeGrand Observer. Union County icon remembered for renegade reputation and compassion. Union County lost a one-of-a-kind character Monday, a man with a big reputation, an even bigger heart, and the possessor of answers to an enduring question. Sam Horrell, known by many as the Sheriff of Sammyville, a collection of 14 rented dwellings about 6 miles northwest of Elgin, died Monday. Horrell, 84, passed away in his home. His health had been failing for several years. Until about 4 years ago, Horrell was the landlord of Sammyville, a community filled with many people down on their luck and sometimes on the wrong side of the law. Its residents welcomed Horrell's low rent and acceptance. He would rent to people nobody else wanted. He would take them in, said retired Union County Sheriff Steve Oliver. Known for the pistol strapped to his side, Horrell had an intimidating presence. The gun was sometimes exposed, and on other occasions it was under his bib overalls, said Donna Knox of LeGrand, a retired chief civil officer for the Union County Sheriff's Office. Knox made many visits to Sammyville in the 1970s and 80s. Sammyville had a bad reputation then, but I always felt secure when Sammy was there, Knox said. He'd come up to me and say, "I'm your deputy." Hey everybody, thank you so much for listening to this 2-part series. It really probably could have been one long episode, but I had something up my sleeve and I did not get to put it out there. My grandpa actually knew Sammy Horrell of Sammyville fame, and I've been trying to work out a way to get him on the phone. I was blocking that up for a good chunk of this episode, and that did not happen this week, so that's my bad. I apologize. In my planning, there was a few extra minutes tacked onto here. But anyways, I appreciate that you've listened anyways. Generally speaking, this is the part of the show where I plug all of the things that I would like you to check out. But it's been a weird week, hasn't it? It's been a very, very strange week. I'm sure that you are all aware of the world events that are happening. At one point in this show, I used to talk about politics and world events and religion and things like that. Turns out it is very bad for the show. So that's why I didn't lead off with saying this. I suppose if you're sticking around until the very end, you must be a true fan. Obviously, I stand in as much solidarity as I possibly can with the people of Ukraine. As I sit here in my very comfortable and safe chair, my thoughts and prayers are with the people of Ukraine and all of the soldiers for every team, every side. If you've been listening to this show long enough, you know that I absolutely abhor warfare. I think senselessly killing is the worst facet of humanity, because no matter what, each side thinks that they're right, and obviously in this side one of them is not right, but the people on the ground that are actually at risk and are shooting and being shot at, they've been programmed to think that they're the good guys on both sides. So my prayers are with everyone involved in this conflict. I hope and I pray that we can find a quick resolution. However, until then, I will send us off with the Ukrainian national anthem. It is a very beautiful national anthem. Stick around and listen to it, definitely. If you feel like supporting, I will drop a couple of reputable links in my show notes, though I am hesitant to do so because I have seen a number of very disturbing, fraudulent charities set up to help Ukraine, which is really, really disappointing that in this moment of almost near global, solidarity, there are still people, trying to make a quick buck. And I suppose it will always be that way, but I want to avoid adding any fuel to that. Also, this is unlikely, but if there are any obscure merch sales this week, I will just donate all of those proceeds A portion is already budgeted out to American Red Cross because I have baked that into the cost of everything. But if I see any money coming in from any of the merch, I will just send it to one of the funds that I will list below. Anyways, I apologize again that this was such a short episode. I did have something else planned, but next week, perhaps maybe things will work out. Okay. I hope that you guys have a very nice and very safe week. I'll talk to you later.